Hello, my name's Larry Poos, and I'm delighted to be back in the Red Rose County, even though it's only virtual for now, but I hope in person again very soon. Let me get my screen changed and we will get started. There we are. My title for today is Love, Hate, and the Law in Tudor Lancashire, The Three Wives of Ralph Rishton. In this presentation, I'm summarizing a book that I hope will be out in a year or so, and the research project for that book has preoccupied me for more years now than I care to think. It's taken me to at least a dozen different archives, and Preston, of course, has been one of the most important of those all along. So it's very appropriate for me to thank the Friends of Lancashire Archives for inviting me to speak to you, and also thanks to the wonderful people who make Lancashire Archives a place I always look forward to coming back to. But above all, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. Ralph Rishton was born in about 1522, we're not sure of the exact year, and he died in January 1573. Not a long life then, but certainly an eventful one. He was a member of a minor gentry family in East Lancashire, and like dozens of others of that description from that time, he could well have remained in obscurity, relegated to the gentry genealogies that 19th century antiquaries loved to compile, or to the footnotes in the Victoria County history. But the trail he left in the historical record is remarkable for several reasons. He had three wives, starting when he was 9 years old, and which of those three, if any, was really his wife according to the laws of marriage at the time remained undetermined until after he died. He and his immediate family were unbelievably litigious. Within the space of a few decades, they were involved in at least 75 lawsuits. It's hard to be precise about the exact number. Not coincidentally, a lot of that litigation stemmed from disputes over his marriages and his property. Most remarkably, by sheer chance, the records of the various courts that the Rishtons went through happened to survive for the decades in question, and it turns out, owing to the details of the various court systems of England generally, and the Duchy and Palatinate of Lancaster specifically at the time, many of the most consequential cases happened in courts that used depositions, that is, sworn statements by witnesses, as part of their process. So these statements of what people claim to have seen and heard make for an especially vivid set of materials. And that makes it possible to piece together a comprehensive picture of the way they navigated through the courts to trace their lives in very unusual, vivid detail. So that makes Rafe and his wives a perfect case study about life in mid-Tudor Lancashire, but also about how people of Rafe's type use the various court systems in England. At the core of all this is an extraordinary story, or perhaps stories, since there are many strands to follow, and I have time to summarize here only a few. The first part of my presentation today is my own reconstruction of the main parts of those stories, but historians think about stories not just as narratives for their own sake, but also because they tell us something we may not grasp so well without them. So for that reason, then I'll turn to what I think the Rishton stories tell us, and that means, above all, what law meant, how it infused the lives of the people around him and people like him. Finally, I'll look at what I call the afterlife of the Rishton stories. As was common for gentry families in 16th century Lancashire, the Rishton surname was spread among a number of family branches. They acknowledged assumed shared kinship without necessarily being able to articulate their exact genealogical connections, which often went back many generations. Different branches of the family identified their branches by their particular manor house or other principal place of residence. So the two main branches of the Rishton family in the 1500s were the Rishtons of Potthalsh, which is here on the map, and Duncanhalsh, which is here on the map. As you can see, these were east of Blackburn and just north of Accrington. There were also Rishtons of Antley, Rishtons of Sparth, Rishtons of Micklehayes, and a number of other places that are on this map that are all within a few miles of each other. Potthalsh was the manor house of the manor of Church. It was rebuilt in the 18th century, and that's what you see here in this photo from the early 1900s. But in Tudor times, the estate included a stone-built house, extensive gardens and outbuildings, and about 800 acres of land. From Henry VIII's time to early in Elizabeth's time, it belonged to Roger Rishton, and he is here, born about 1505, died about 1563. Rafe was his eldest son, and William was his second son. Duncanhalsh, barely a quarter of a mile away, was a more substantial property. In the second quarter of the 16th century, it belonged to Henry Rishton, and he is here, born about 1507 and died about 1549. And Henry Rishton trained as a lawyer in London in an Inn of Chancery and probably was a clerk for Cardinal Wolsey when Wolsey was Chancellor. In Henry's time, it included half the manor of Clayton Lamores, a quarter of the manor of Rishton, and about 2,500 acres of property extending as far away as Lancaster. So a very substantial estate. Duncanhalsh has been through two major rebuildings since the time I'm describing. This view from the late 18th century may give some sense of its status as a manor house, and you probably know it as in its current reincarnation as a hotel. The first part of the Rishton stories involves Roger of Potthalsh and Henry of Duncanhalsh. From the 1530s to the 1560s, Roger was involved in repeated acts of violence and conflict, and the focus of some of those acts was the church called Churchkirk, which was mostly rebuilt in the 19th century, except for the tower, which was late medieval, and it's sadly now closed. Churchkirk lay just a few minutes' walk away from Potthalsh. Now it takes a little bit longer since the Leeds to Liverpool Canal runs between the two. In this map from 1785, you can see Duncanhalsh and its grounds up here at the top, and you can also see that a way extended over a bridge along here past Potthalsh, which is right here, and on to Churchkirk. And this is the line of the canal as it is today. In early 1536, Roger Rishton of Potthalsh, Henry Rishton of Duncanhalsh, and someone from yet another branch, Nicholas Rishton of Antley, near Accrington, had a series of three-way conflicts, and they centered on the church, Churchkirk. Nicholas stole liturgical items and threatened the congregants there. Henry likewise stole vestments and books, and most spectacularly, Roger, along with an armed band of men, all with their faces blacked, took the benches and private pews that belonged to Nicholas and Henry out of the church and burnt them in a bonfire in the churchyard. He also cut down the bridge that led from Duncanhalsh to Churchkirk and shot Nicholas in the shoulder with an arrow. In 1542, Roger had a brawl with one of the most powerful men in the area, Thomas Talbot, who was later sheriff and MP for Lancashire, and who figures in the Rishton stories in other ways. Talbot assaulted Roger and nearly killed him. A few months later, Talbot came to Churchkirk and confiscated an arsenal of weapons and armor that Roger had stockpiled in the church's tower. This is the interior of the late medieval tower of Church Kirk. Talbot claimed Roger was planning some kind of insurrection, but Roger claimed that the arsenal was just his own gear and storage, which he'd used when he'd led a group of his tenants as a company in the English wars in Scotland. So he simply regarded the church tower as his own place of deposit for that. This was a kind of dramatic standoff. Roger claimed Talbot brought a contingent of armed men to threaten Roger's tenants, and he seized the keys of the church and sealed it for a while. In 1555, Roger was involved in a prolonged conflict with a woman named Isabel Holden, wife of another gentleman of the locality. Roger sexually defamed her. He claimed she'd been, in his words, naughty with a lad, ejected from her father's house because of illicit sex, and in his words again, she had lost all her friends with her ass. In mid-mass, in Church Kirk one day, with the whole congregation watching, when Isabel was kneeling on the steps of the chancel, Roger confronted her, saying, he claimed, simply, the chancel is no place for a woman. But others who were there told the story differently. Here's what one witness said he saw and heard. So this is a deposition by Roger Hindle, one of the members of the congregation there. That's what a deposition looks like. He said, about 3 weeks or a month after Michaelmas last was a 12-month, when at Isabel Holden being in the church, she kneeled upon the least step in the choir before the high altar at mass time. And even by she were well set on her knees, comes the said Roger Rishton, took her by the arms, and did violently trail her, so that her loins did hang upon the ground, from that place where she sat unto the choir door in the said church, and thereafter much toiling of her let her fall from him, saying, the devil is in her. Isabel sued Roger and his wife for defamation in the diocesan court of Chester and won, and she won again when the Rishtons appealed the case to the provincial court at York. It's no secret that English people were extremely litigious in the 1500s. Roger, as you can tell, was especially contentious. We know about his conflicts because they went through so many different courts. He and the people he had conflicts with particularly used a court called the Duchy of Lancashire Court, also called Duchy Chamber. And that was a court in the Palace of Westminster. As you can see, it is in this little annex to the ancient Westminster Hall, and that's why the court was called Duchy Chamber, after the room it met. This court had jurisdiction over all the duchy's lands in England and Wales, and one revelation of the Rishton cases generally was how much Duchy Chamber came to be a court of first and rapid recourse for Lancashire people. Over the last 30 years or so of his life, Roger was involved in Duchy Chamber cases on average about one case a year. Despite all these cases starting out as litigation and civil lawsuits, most ended up being resolved by fines and binding over, whereby a justice of the peace made a person swear to observe the peace against an antagonist or else suffer a penalty and money. This is kind of the Tudor equivalent of the ASBO of the Tony Blair era. Several things stand out of all this. One, in all these cases, Roger, as lord of the local manor, dominant gentleman as he saw himself of the neighborhood, was asserting his authority over the church, his authority to command sacred space. Where people sat in church mattered. This is a seating plan, a very rare kind of document, a seating plan for Church Kirk drawn up a few decades later. It assigns households in the church to rows in pews. So the front row on one side, this particular household named here was assigned that pew, and then another one here, and so on, all the way back. Richer people sat in front, poorer people behind. And this may be the first time Church Kirk had comprehensive seating for everyone. Before the Reformation, it was common for most to stand in church, and so those who had their own private seats or pews would have been all the more conspicuous, like Henry's. Henry claimed his seat as part of his rights as Lord of Duncanhosh. So by destroying his rival's seats in Church Kirk, Roger was declaring his control of sacred space in a very visible way. And in other cases, Roger was claiming a proprietary right over the church as well, to store his weapons in the church, to dictate who could be where in it. Another thing, as we've seen, the witness testimony gives us a very evocative sense of the world these folks occupied. That's why they're so valuable. Third, in complicated conflicts like this, people went to court very quickly to sue in civil cases. In the case, for instance, of the violence in 1536, they had started court cases within a couple of months of the actual actions. But very few of these cases actually went to judgment. Instead, plaintiffs were trying to force defendants to another conclusion, such as arbitration, or in the hope that the criminal law would take up and resolve the dispute. And that's what happened in the 1536 and 1542 clashes. So that's the first part of the Rishton stories. The second and larger part dealt with Roger's son, Rafe. And this slide, which you'll see again, summarizes Rafe's 3 marriages. In 1531, Rafe exchanged marriage vows with Ellen, the daughter of Richard Townley, from a branch of the Townley family based at Royal, just northwest of Burnley. The site of this was the beautiful church of St. James in Altham, which had been rebuilt just a few years earlier. At the time, Rafe was about 9 years old and Ellen about 10. Now, this, of course, sounds very strange to us. The laws of marriage in 16th century England, which were essentially unchanged from medieval Catholic canon law, didn't regard marriage vows of minors to be valid in themselves. But if a couple then reached the age of majority, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, and they continued to live together, to treat each other as man and wife, especially if they had sex, then their marriage was valid and binding in law. And child marriage was one of the most distinctive aspects of gentry and yeoman society in Tudor Lancashire. We know this because of the sheer volume of cases brought in the diocesan consistory court of Chester to try to annul them some years after they'd been entered into. In the mid-1500s, I estimate there were about somewhere between 5 and 10 such cases initiated in Lancashire every year. Another aspect of this marriage system was spatial. Tudor Lancashire gentry married closer to home, geographically speaking, than in other parts of England, and the result was a gentry class with short generation lengths, tightly knit and complex kinship networks with their near neighbors, in effect, a fairly inbred group who looked to each other for legal and other kinds of support. In his mid-teens, Rafe followed a typical pattern for boys of his class. He went to Middleton Hall in Middleton in southern Lancashire to train at arms with Richard Ashton, a veteran soldier, and eventually fought in several battles in the Scottish Wars. Meanwhile, back home, very sadly, Ellen became mentally ill. It would be intriguing to try to diagnose her affliction now, almost 500 years later, but there just isn't enough in the way of specific description to make that feasible. She remained lunatic, as her contemporaries called her, till she died in the late 1550s. In 1546, Rafe exchanged marriage vows in Clitheroe Church with Elizabeth Parker. Her family home was Horrocksford, just north of Clitheroe. She was pregnant then, with the first of what would be 6 children between her and Rafe. The first went on to become a priest in the new Church of England during Elizabeth's time, of all things. But wait, what about Ellen? The widow of Ellen's lawyer brother went to court to assert Ellen's claims, first to the property that had been part of the original marriage settlement between Rafe and Ellen, and the Rishtons ended up compromising by paying for Ellen's care at a cottage on the Pothouse estate, kind of like an extended hospice arrangement. But the more obvious problem was Ellen's and Rafe's marriage. The documentation makes it clear that Rafe and his circle of friends around him bribed a judge of the Diocese of Chester to create a forged decree of annulment. There are 2 surviving copies, and this is one of them. This was entered into evidence in one of the many court cases that came some years later. Rafe's final marriage was with Anne Stanley. Her father was James Stanley of Crosshall near Ormskirk. Anne was the niece of the 2nd Earl of Derby, and Thomas Talbot was her stepbrother. Witnesses related that Rafe fell into love and fancy for her. Yes, the word fancy, meaning to feel romantic or sexual attraction to someone, dates back to the 16th century. At any rate, in 1552, Rafe had gotten her pregnant too, while he, of course, was still, to all appearances, married to Elizabeth. Since his teen years, Rafe had been Thomas Talbot's protege and Talbot his patron. Rafe fought in Scotland under Talbot's command, and Talbot helped to broker the arrangements for Rafe's spurious annulment from Ellen and his marriage to Elizabeth. Talbot's solution to this latest dilemma was ingenious. At the urging of Anne's mother, possibly to avert the stigma of Anne's illegitimate pregnancy, Talbot forced Anne to marry. But marry whom? The solution was right at hand. Henry Rishton of Duncanhalsh had died in 1549, leaving an underaged son and heir, John. Since the Duncanhalsh estate was a property of the Duchy of Lancaster, and since, as with estates of the Crown, the wardships of underage heirs could be bought and sold, John Rishton's wardship eventually came into the hands of Thomas Talbot, who then gave personal custody of John to Ralph Rishton. Early one morning in 1552, Talbot sent his servants to force Anne and John to the church of Great Harwood and coerced them to undergo the marriage ceremony, very much against both their wills. One of the most striking bits of witness testimony about this comes from a woman named Margaret, originally Margaret Fielden, later Margaret Haddock. Margaret had been a close friend of Anne's since childhood, and she said that after this forced marriage, Anne fled to Margaret's house to hide. But, and this is again a deposition in a subsequent court case, certain of the said Lady Anne Stanleys, that's the mother of Anne, gentlewomen, found the said Anne Stanley, alias Rishton, in Margaret's father's house the same night, and carried her home to her mother's house, sore against her will, who, when she, the said Anne Stanley, was going to bed, being thereunto compelled by her mother and brother, Talbot, articulate, she made great lamentation. And as this examinate, that is Margaret, was pulling off her hose, being first sent for, the said Anne Stanley would not go to bed unless this examinate would lie with her, insomuch that she, the said Anne, being wrapped in a sheet, did lie so wrapped all the night, and so continued until the morning next following, although the said John Rishton did then lie in the same bed, of this examinate's certain knowledge. lying in the same bed all night with the said parties, and during all the same night the said John Rishton had not carnal knowledge, that is, sex, with the said Anne, to this examine its knowledge. A very memorable wedding night, I think. And over the course of the next few years, Rafe left Elizabeth. Anne continued to be Rafe's mistress and bore him several children while she continued to be married to John. And this made for some very uncomfortable scenes. And I'll choose just one of them, and that is in this deposition by John Dugdale, again some years later in another court case. About 17 or 18 years ago, this examinant, that's Dugdale, kept an alehouse in Rishton, and was then tenant to John Rishton, which John Rishton, oftentimes about the same time, frequented this examinant's house, and has drunk in the same. Where and when this examinant hath heard him, the said John Rishton, oftentimes say that Jane Rishton, yet living, and Harry Rishton, now deceased, which were born of the body of the said Anne Stanley, at such times as this examinant hath requested the said John to be good to his two children, if they were his, swear by God's blood they were none of his children, but Rafe Rishton's, and further that the said Anne was an old whore, and the said Rafe Rishton a false harlot and a knave. John Rishton was hapless. In addition to this humiliation of his old marriage, his odd marriage, he faced an even greater calamity. The details of this emerge from a case John brought in the Court of Star Chamber quite a few years after the fact, and that case never went to any judgment because John died before it could get very far. In that case, John claimed that Rafe had taken John with him to London, had taken him to see a lawyer who drew up what John thought was an estate settlement to secure John's property title, but which turned out to be a surrender of the whole Duncanhalsh estate to Rafe. Rafe paid John £400 and assigned an annuity to him, and so after 2 centuries at least, Duncanhalsh was lost to that branch of the Rishton family forever. Some of the key people in this drama died in the late 1550s. Rafe's first wife, Ellen, Anne Stanley's mother, Talbot himself, and freed from the restraints that these people might have exerted, Anne sued in the diocesan court at Chester for an annulment from John, claiming coercion, and got a decree in 1560. And the next year, Rafe exchanged married vows with Anne at Duncanhalsh. But Rafe didn't keep Duncanhalsh long. Thomas Walmsley, later Mr. Justice Walmsley of the Court of Common Pleas at Westminster, bought the Duncanhalsh estate and much of its attached lands from Rafe Rishton in 1571, just 2 years before Rafe died. It's not clear why Rafe sold. He might have been in debt. What you see here is a copy of the conveyance, which names Rafe, Anne, and Rafe's eldest son by Elizabeth, another Roger, as the grantors, the latter perhaps to bar any future claims the younger Roger might seek in the property later. One noteworthy thing about this deed, there at the arrow, Rafe signed it with a mark of the cross, not his name, and I have some speculation as to whether he was actually illiterate, since by this time ability to sign one's name is usually a basic indicator of literacy. When Rafe lay on his deathbed in January 1573, he was well aware that a case was pending in the Court of High Commission for ecclesiastical causes at York. Elizabeth had brought a suit and technically called a plea of restitution of conjugal rights. This was a claim in law that sought to get an affirmation of her marriage to Rafe and an order to him to take her back and treat her as his spouse. She claimed first that the child marriage between Ellen and Rafe had never been ratified by mutual consent or sexual relations after they came of age, because Ellen had gone insane before she was capable of giving informed consent. Second, she cited the supposed annulment. Rafe's response? Elizabeth had known all along perfectly well that the annulment was a forgery, and he knew, and he claimed that she knew that he'd been legally married to Ellen until Ellen's death, and so never could have been Elizabeth's lawful husband. But after Ellen's death, Rafe married Anne, and so now Anne was his wife. Rafe died before the case concluded, but what it did conclude was a proverbial bombshell. Completely unexpectedly, the court reversed the annulment of John and Anne's marriage and declared that they were still married to each other. The rest of the story is one of continued lawsuits. Ellen was the tragic figure among Rafe's wives. Elizabeth was the fighter. Undeterred by the York case, she promptly sued for dower at the Common Pleas Court in Westminster, claiming to be Rafe's widow. That sent her back to Chester for that court to look into her marriage claims, and she lost. So neither Elizabeth nor Anne had ever been Rafe's wife according to the laws of marriage, whatever they may have thought at various times along the way. At about the same time, Elizabeth also sued in Duchy Chamber for a property that Rafe had given her as jointure and later taken away, and this time she won. She had the documents to prove it. A parallel story I won't get into here is about Rafe's very devious maneuvers regarding his own estate, especially Potalsh. He drew up mutually contradictory estate settlements, apparently favoring different heirs, and some of them were clearly fraudulent. But in the end, Rafe's brother William inherited Potalsh. Litigation, however, went on for another decade, mostly in Duchy Chamber by various people making claims to parts of Rafe's property, especially by Rafe's son with Elizabeth, Roger. In the end, the court of Duchy Chamber forced an arbitrated compromise that gave Roger a life estate in some of Rafe's property. I'd argue this was a kind of equitable conclusion because the court must have felt some kind of moral claim by Roger. Let me end this part of the presentation with a few points. Historians who study law in earlier centuries of English history look at case patterns in particular courts or the extent of particular courts' competence. But England didn't have one legal system. It had multiple ones. It had common law in courts like Common Pleas, ecclesiastical law in courts of the church, equity, which in theory filled in the gaps between parts of common law in courts like Chancery or Duchy Chamber, and customary law in manor courts. It's much more difficult to trace a complicated set of fact patterns through all these, but the Rishtons are a case in point of legal adroitness, of being able to move back and forth between these courts, in some cases because they had choices of courts to sue, and some because they were simply trying to beleaguer opponents with maximum pressure, some because different parts of one larger enterprise had to be placed into different courts, different places. Another is that Lancashire, even though geographically far away from the center of English government and politics, was what I call a lawyer-rich environment. During the last few decades of Rafe's life, I've identified at least a dozen, maybe more, men living within a few miles of Potalsh who'd had legal training at Inns of Court or Chancery in London. Most of them practiced in the central courts at Westminster during law term and relocated back to their country residences in between. Others, like William Rishton, Rafe's brother, had some legal training but lived a country gentleman's life without practicing law in any way. Some of these lawyers acted as counsel in some of the Rishton lawsuits. Lawyers were never far away, literally. And historians who study the law in early modern England use a phrase, law-mindedness, to describe the ways in which knowledge and understanding of law, making use of its concepts, its language, was a natural way of framing their understanding of their interests. It permeated their words and actions. And having lawyers close by, no doubt, helped to foster that, but also networks of gentry joined by kinship and neighborly ties served as practical means for people like Roger and Rafe Rishton to accomplish their aims, whatever they were. They acted as trustees for each other's estate settlements. They stood surety for them in binding over, acted as witnesses on their behalf, acted as delegated agents of the state, or in this case, the Duchy and Palatinate of Lancaster, in a variety of ways. Finally, we come back to stories. Legal contests are in some ways contests of competing stories, and the Rishton lawsuits brought into being a lot of witness depositions. If you take, as I have done, all of the depositions from all their cases and turn them into word process texts, they add up to about 135,000 words. And I've quoted just a handful in this presentation. In the book, I use a lot more because it seems to me that they immerse us in the language and worldviews of those who participated in various ways. And there are issues of interpreting them, which I won't go into now. But another advantage of a case study like this one is it lets us piece together a lot of these statements, any one of which might be very partial, misleading, actually false, and reconciling them into what I believe is a compatible whole. The Rishton stories had a long afterlife. Who preserved and transmitted parts of them, how and why, show how the stories have served multiple purposes in the centuries since Rafe's death. Duncan Hall remained Thomas Walmsley's principal house for the rest of his life and for generations of his heirs after. He was very aggressive in buying up property throughout Lancashire. By one estimate, he paid £32,000 over his lifetime on property acquisitions, which is roughly the equivalent of £10 million today. He was a lawyer, so he was also very aggressive in going to court against his neighbors, asserting what he thought were his rights. And as a lawyer, he was also a very careful curator of what he called his evidences, charters and deeds to his property, materials from his lawsuits, keeping them in a room at Duncan Hall. She called his evidences closet. He also kept two commonplace books, or memoranda books. One's now at Preston, the other's in Philadelphia, of all places, in which he kept everything from recipes for ale concoctions and cures for gout to notes of the party he had after becoming a sergeant at law, to accounts of land he acquired and the complications of their legal status. And in those ways, he was, in a sense, the first chronicler of the Rishton stories, and he and his descendants' estate papers, now the Peter collection in Lancashire Archives, are very important in making it possible to trace the tortuous descent of property involved with the Rishtons. Christopher Townley was a distant relative of Rafe's first wife, Ellen. Townley was intensely interested in Lancashire history, especially as embodied in its old families, and he sought out and made copies of an enormous volume of charters, wills, genealogy, and other documents from gentry families' private muniments. His transcriptions now add up to more than 50 volumes. And those volumes preserve a lot of the genealogical history of the county's landed families, including some parts of the Rishton story that haven't survived otherwise. Townley also wrote the first narrative version of Rafe Rishton's marital career, This is in a note he added to a family tree of the Rishtons of Potalsh in one of his volumes that's now in the British Library. He wrote, Rafe Rishton, who first married with Mr. Townley's daughter of Royal, keeping a woman called Elizabeth Parker, by whom he had divers children, and also took Anne Stanley, the wife of John Rishton, and married her, John yet living, and had divers children by her, and by her means he got Duncanalsh, and afterwards sold it to Judge Walmsley. William proved the children of Rafe Rishton, his brother, to be bastards, and so became heir of Potalsh. F.R. Rains, better known as Canon Rains, spent the last 36 years of his life as perpetual curate of Milnrow near Rochdale, and in some eerie sense he might have been the reincarnation of Christopher Townley, since Rains also spent what seems to have been abundant leisure time collecting evidences. He eventually compiled 44 volumes of them that are now in Chetham's Library in Manchester. And again, some of the materials he collected about Rafe Rishton's wives do not survive otherwise. So unless he and Townley had preserved these things and put them in these volumes, we wouldn't know parts of the story. He also kept up a lively correspondence with his fellow antiquaries, and some of that would no doubt horrify our friends who administer Lancashire archives today, because he writes about going to the archives of Chester Cathedral and taking home with him bags of wills to read through at his leisure, and exchanging through the post with his fellow antiquaries documents he thought were interesting. Rains became very interested in Rafe Rishton and published short potted versions of his story with some appropriate Victorian moral lessons, though he was only aware of a very small part of the original source material. But what he published was enough to provide fodder for an entirely new venue for local history, which is a really important story in its own right. Starting in the last couple of decades of the 1800s, local newspapers in East Lancashire, as everywhere else in England, developed regular column features telling and retelling noteworthy local history stories. This early example from the Burnley Express in 1892 is actually a direct paraphrase from Rains. As you can see, Marriages and Morals in the 16th Century, a much married East Lancashire squire of the Tudor period. The story appeared again and again, and I found dozens of examples over the next 30 years in newspapers from Blackburn, Accrington, and Burnley. This one from the Burnley News. There was a regular feature called Literary and Antiquarian Gleanings, and this story is under the headline, A Curious Old-Time Wedding in Altham Church. Got the date completely wrong. And this one from the Lancashire Daily Post in 1940, during the war, as you can see, because up in the left-hand corner, it has the hours for blackout for that day. Girl 10, boy 8 were wed at Altham in 1526. They didn't have the right year there either. Each of these was melodramatically wrought, usually with wildly inaccurate dates or other features, and limited more or less to what they could draw from Rains and one or two of his contemporaries, grasping only small pieces of the entirety and sensationalizing whenever possible. And probably the most blatant example of the sensationalizing came in Richard Ainsworth's Old Homesteads of Accrington, first published from 1917 on in the Accrington Observer and Times, and gathered together in a book in the 1920s, also reprinted in the 1980s with tabloid-like titles like this, Bigamy and Madness After Child Wedding. But I'd argue that these local history columns and their revolving repertoire of stories like the Rishtons were not merely lurid entertainment or misty nostalgia, but rather a way of encouraging a sense of place, a past that offered an opportunity for the reader to be repelled and titillated, yes, above all by child marriage, which was the most prominent feature of these retellings, but also one that was real because it happened where the readers lived, in places where protagonists' homes, or at least the sites of them, at least in Ainsworth's day, were familiar parts of the landscape. A way to cultivate not nostalgia exactly, but rather a sense of historical place. So let me end by saying that in that way, I think the writers of these stories were not that far away from our own understanding of the importance of local history, its significance, local history, and the stories that come from it as a way of making the past more vivid, more interesting, more comprehensive. And I'm just another reteller of those stories. Again, thank you for joining, and I hope I passed on to you just a little bit of my fascination with the Rishtons for everyone. Thanks.